Good evening, everybody. It's really great to see you tonight. Thanks for being here as we join together for Bible study on Wednesday night. We have been studying in Ezra and Nehemiah, the two historic books that talk about the Jews returning from captivity. And you didn't have a heads-up warning about this, but actually we hope to wrap up our study of Nehemiah tonight. We already did Ezra. We've been studying in Nehemiah, and we hope to wrap up that study tonight. If you looked ahead at your study guide, it looked like the author of our questions was probably struggling to come up with enough questions to fill the page on a couple of these lessons. So I thought, I'm just going to lump them all together, and we'll just cover, starting in chapter 11. So we're going to look at chapter 11, 12, and 13 tonight. And a lot of that is just sort of a listing of names, and so we can go pretty quickly through that. As a heads up, what we plan to do starting next week, Lord willing, is to dive in and do a little bit different study. Instead of studying through a book or a series of books, we're going to take a topic for a few weeks of study, and it's a familiar topic to us, but we think a really important one. We want to talk about baptism. We're going to take a deep dive into the topic of baptism starting next Wednesday night, Lord willing. And there's some study questions on the table in the back if you're inclined to take those and help prepare for our discussion about baptism. But let's move quickly here on these initial questions in chapter 11 as we try to wrap up our study of Nehemiah. Now remember, we often quiz the kids about who led the Jews back from captivity. Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah. All right, so we're talking about Nehemiah, and we're talking about sort of the last part of the information, the historical information we have about Nehemiah. There was a problem that there weren't enough people living in and about Jerusalem. Way back in chapter 7 at verse 4, it says, "Now the city was large and great, but the people were few therein, and the houses were not builded." And so they had the wall finished, but the city still was not heavily occupied at all. The population was low. And the question was asked, why would this be an issue? Why would you have an issue that there's just not hardly anybody living within the walls of Jerusalem? We got the walls up now, nobody's living within the walls. I think probably a couple things come to my mind. This would be a problem, first of all, just for defense of the city. If you didn't have very many people in the city, that it would pretty obviously be hard to defend the city against attack. And we know that attacks from one place or another, from one tribe or another, very common in those days. And so you couldn't assume, we build the city of Columbia, we have absolutely no thought that some opposing army may attack. How are we going to defend our city? That's not even on our minds. I mean, we don't even think that way. Back then, you had to think that way. And so I think having a base of population within the city would have been important for defense purposes. But I think also this is the hub. This is the focal point. This is the capital city. This is where all the government officials are located. This is the base of authority. And if Jerusalem didn't prosper, the surrounding regions around Jerusalem probably wouldn't prosper either. And so probably it was important to get this city built and occupied for defense and prosperity. Tom?
This was a place that, where the central portion of the Jews would come to worship. There were times that they were all supposed to make a journey to Jerusalem, and if there wasn't enough population there, then you don't have the support services.
That's a good point. You're a very good point. You remember when Jesus sent his apostles ahead to prepare the Passover? You'll find a man, and he'll have an upper room. And so there, in Jesus' day, and the city was well built, there would have even been accommodations for these periodic worshipers who had to come to Jerusalem. Good point. Wade.
So do you think maybe because the people had come back to their homelands, that they were trying to occupy their territories that the Lord had given them.
Yes. In fact, let's read in chapter 11. It basically says that in chapter 11, verse 1, the rulers of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people also cast lots to bring 1 of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9 parts to dwell in other cities. And the people blessed all the men that willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. Now, these are the chief of the province that dwelt at Jerusalem, but in the cities of Judah dwelt everyone in his possession, in his cities. To wit, Israel, the priests, the Levites, the Nethinim, the children of Solomon's servants. And at Jerusalem dwelt certain of the children of Benjamin, and so on it goes. But it does say what Wade just suggested. They had their own properties that they were interested in attending to. Maybe I got 100 acres over here, and if I'm in Jerusalem, nobody's taking care of my 100-acre pasture over here. And so they were interested in their own inherited property and so forth. And so in order to solve this problem, it says that they cast lots. It was determined we need 1 out of 10 people living within Jerusalem. And so there were some, it says, who willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. And then there were those who they cast lots to bring 1 and 10 to live within Jerusalem. What about this casting of lots business? Was it just a random chance of the draw, or was it something else? What do you think? Monty?
Sometimes I think it may have been a random chance of the draw, but at other times we see that phrase used in the scriptures. It has to do, I think, with at least divine providence, and maybe even miraculous intervention, God causing the lot to be cast a certain way to get his desired outcome. So occasionally, this right here, I think, was probably a random chance. But other places in the scripture, I think there's some divine intervention of some sort.
I think you're right. And the one that comes to my mind, as you were suggesting, is when Judas had committed suicide and they were going to replace him as one of the 12 apostles, and there were 2 men, and they cast lots, and the lot fell upon Matthias to take Judas's place. You have to believe that probably God's hand of intervention was in that casting of lots to produce a choice. Other times, you can't say for sure. This time, I don't know that there would have been any reason for God to intervene in this casting of lots, other than maybe somebody said he wanted to make sure that there were good people dwelling in Jerusalem, maybe. But we just don't know. But that's how they did it. So they wanted 1 out of 10. 10% of the people living in the city, 90% in the regions round about the city. And so that's what they did. There's a listing here of a whole bunch of different people who were involved. And if I counted right, question 12 on this chapter, how many priests came to live in Jerusalem? If I added that up right, I got 1,192 priests. And then it asked how many Levites, and I got 284. Now, if my math is right, there were more than 3 times, almost 4 times as many priests as there were Levites listed. What do you think about that? Does that seem like that would be reasonable? I'm thinking maybe it was reasonable because the priest had active duty. You think about the specific work of the Levites when they were originally set apart to tend to the tabernacle and the affairs of the tabernacle, and they had to take down the tabernacle, load up everything, and transport it and set it back up. There was lots of work for the Levites to do in the early days, on the tabernacle days, but now potentially maybe not as much work for Levites, more work for the priests, who were also Levites, by the way, but they were special Levites. So again, I don't know if those numbers tell us anything or not. I got 1,192 priests and 284 Levites. Maybe so. I don't know. Chapter 11, verse 20 says, The residue of Israel, of the priests, the Levites, were in all the cities of Judah, everyone in his inheritance. Back again to what Wade was suggesting. They were particularly interested in making sure their own inheritance was cared for. So there's a long listing in chapter 12. There's a long listing beginning at verse 1 and running all the way down to verse 26 about the lineage of the priests, and of course leading up to the high priest, and a whole bunch of names and so forth and so on. And we're not going to take time to read them, obviously. But again, we have to be impressed that there was care taken to preserve the genealogical records of the Jews. And we've talked about the fact that that was probably even somewhat amazing, considering the fact that when Jerusalem was conquered and destroyed, that those records were preserved during the time of the captivity, and now during the time of the return, they have kept up with all of that, which is really impressive that they would do that. Of course, we understand that in God's eternal plan, it was absolutely necessary, because it was going to be necessary to come along and prove that Jesus is the promised one, and part of the necessity of that is proving that he is of the necessary lineage. He had to be a descendant of Abraham. Of course, all the Jews were. But he had to be a descendant of King David as well. And so it was necessary for our sake to be able to prove the genealogy of Jesus, for their sake to prove who had the right to serve as priest. And they kept all that. And you got to think that that was pretty amazing that that was done even during the time of the captivity and the return. So so someone says, what in the world? What's that list in there for? Why do I have to read that? Why do I have to go through all those difficult names? I can't even pronounce them. Well, you don't have to pronounce them. It doesn't matter if you can pronounce them or not. The very fact that they're there is an important bit of biblical information that we need. Any thoughts or comments? Wade?
Yeah, you kind of wonder too, people don't want to read the names, but God put them in there for a reason.
Yeah.
And I think we should read the names. I mean, maybe we can't
Okay.
pronounce them as well.
We'll grant you the floor.
But don't you think, if God didn't want them in there, he wouldn't have put them in there.
Yeah. And when I'm reading on my own, I read through them. I know I don't even come close to saying them right. But they're there for a reason. And there may be you might could list multiple reasons, but I would argue the two that we mentioned have to be high on the list of reasons. One, for the proof of who could be priest, but especially the proof that Jesus was the right lineage to be the Messiah. All right. Okay, so if you're looking at your study guide, skip to the next questions that come about the second half of chapter 12. The first half of chapter 12 is that long list of priests and lineage. The last part of chapter 12 talks about them dedicating the walls. Now, we know that they got the walls built, but now there's a specific dedication ceremony held concerning the walls. Chapter 12, verse 27. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites out of their places to bring them to Jerusalem to keep the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and with singing, with cymbals, psalteries, and with harps. And the sons of the singers gathered themselves together both out of the plain country round about Jerusalem and from the villages of the Naphtali. Also from the house of Gilgal, out of the fields of Geba and Azmathah. For the singers had built them villages round about Jerusalem. And the priests and the Levites purified themselves and purified the people and the gates and the wall. All right, so they're going to have this dedication ceremony. And the priests are called, and they're going to sort of, I think, we would probably say they were going to direct the affairs of this dedication with thanksgiving, with various music, singers, and instruments. Especially interested there in verse 30. The priests and the Levites purified themselves, purified the people, the gates, and the wall. There seems to be an order of probably that seems appropriate. So the first thing the priests do is purify themselves. Then make sure the people are purified. Then the gates of the city and the wall of the city. And so it probably wouldn't seem right if that order was reversed. And they went about to purify and dedicate the walls, but they themselves were unclean at the time. So it seemed like that progression there probably is significant and means something. So they get ready to dedicate the wall. And what's interesting is they send two parties out. We could get our map out again. I didn't get it out. But they send two parties out going in opposite directions around the perimeter of the wall. And they meet. And they meet right at the temple, right at the area of the temple. And so they sort of did opposite. One went clockwise, one went counterclockwise, and they met at the temple. Look in chapter 12, verse 40. So stood the two companies of them that gave thanks in the house of God, and I and the half of the rulers with me. And so you got to imagine that this was quite an impressive thing that was taking place here in this dedication ceremony. And it produced a lot of gladness on the part of the people. Verse 43, 12:43. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. I think that's pretty impressive that when you are able to get something good done in the work of God, it produces joy in yourself. These people had worked hard, they'd done well, they had accomplished a lot, and it brought joy to them, a sense of joyful satisfaction in being able to accomplish this work that God wanted done. I believe there's a principle there that's still applicable to us. If we are busy in the Lord's work, and when we can see obvious results of that work, results come in different forms, but when we can see that something good is being accomplished in the work of God, that's reason for rejoicing, and we ought to do it. And these people did in this dedication of the wall. Thoughts or comments, anybody? All right. At this time, verse 44, 12:44, at that time were some appointed over the chambers for the treasures, for the offerings, for the firstfruits, for the tithes, to gather into them out of the fields of the city the portion of the law for the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced for the priests and the Levites that waited. And so one of the things that they are going to be careful about here, we're going to read a little bit of problem about that later. One of the things that they were careful to do is set aside. They had special storage and chambers set apart where the portion of the sacrifices that was being made for the priest could be set aside and stored up. And notice that the people rejoiced for the priests and the Levites that waited. In other words, they were grateful and thankful that the priests and the Levites were carrying out their necessary functions in the worship of God. And at this point, they're happy for them, and they're even making sure that the provisions that are planned for them are in fact set aside, properly cared for. There's going to be a problem about that in a minute. All right. Anything through chapter 12? Anybody see anything that we need to make sure and cover in chapter 12? All right, the last chapter then is, I think, the one that's full of information, applicable information for us. In chapter 13, Nehemiah had to return back to the king. Remember, he was the cupbearer for the Persian king, and he had actually granted he had requested and was granted special permission to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. And do you remember that the king said, "Oh yeah, you can go, but how long are you going to be gone?" Almost like, I don't want you to stay forever. I need you back here. And you got the idea that Nehemiah was probably a close, important assistant to the king of Persia. And so when he said, "Yeah, you can go to Jerusalem, but I want to know when you're going to come back. And he went back. Verse 6, look at chapter 13, verse 6. All this time was I not at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king. After certain days obtained I leave of the king. And so he had come back to the king as he had promised that he would. But then, and it doesn't really say how long it was, but after some time, then he asked and was granted permission to go back to Jerusalem again. Okay, so we get that information at verse 6. But some trouble had arisen while he was gone. Let's start reading at verse 1. On that day they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people, and therein was found written that the Ammonites and the Moabites should not come into the congregation of God forever, because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned the curse into a blessing. Now it came to pass when they heard the law that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. Now that I actually think those first verses probably belong in the previous chapter. Okay. But now we read about what transpired while Nehemiah was in absence. Verse 4. Before this, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah. And he prepared for him a great chamber, wherein aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers and the porters and the offerings of the priest. So now something has changed. Instead of being glad for the priests, they have actually taken areas within the temple grounds that had previously been used for storing up the portion of the priest, and they had prepared a chamber for Tobiah. Who's Tobiah, by the way? Somebody remind. He's one of the ones that have been opposing the work of Jerusalem from the get-go, right? Why on earth would they make a chamber within the temple proper for Tobiah? Well, there's a little bit of information. Skip down to verse 28. One of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, therefore I chased him from me. So it was Tobiah and Sanballat, who were the great enemies of the Jews. Of all things, the son of the high priest had married a daughter of Sanballat. If you can imagine that. I mean, that just seems incredible, doesn't it? And so there was a lot of, what word would we use? I think we would use the word corruption. There was a lot of corruption at the highest levels going on here, even to the point that Tobiah had been granted a chamber, a place within the temple proper. It just seems unimaginable. And so, verse 7, it says, I came to Jerusalem and understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God, and it grieved me sore. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers, and thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meat offering and the frankincense. So, and it goes on to say, I perceived that the portion of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled everyone to his own field. And I contended with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. So, things had deteriorated. You'd have to, I think, agree with me that things had deteriorated really rapidly. We don't know how long Nehemiah was gone, but when Nehemiah left to go back to the king, it seemed like the people were at a high spiritual level of enthusiasm and zeal. They were rejoicing in the building of the wall and the dedication of the wall. They were happy for the priests and the Levites and making sure that they got their part that was commanded in the law of Moses, of all that was offered. But in the duration of time, and again, we don't know exactly how long it was. It couldn't have been horribly, terribly long time. But while Nehemiah was gone, this all went off the rails. I mean, they have completely gotten things messed up, even to the point that Tobiah, one of their principal enemies who tried to stop the building of the walls, was now living in the temple. He's not even a Jew, right? And he's living in the temple grounds. And the priests and the Levites are not getting what they are due for the work that they did. And Nehemiah, there's probably a pretty big understatement there at the start of verse 8. It grieved me sore. I imagine that's probably a significant understatement of how mad Nehemiah was when he caught up with this and found out what was going on. And to Nehemiah's credit, we've talked, as we've been studying Nehemiah, what a great leader he was, what a powerful man of faith he was. And, you know, what would we say? He didn't mince words. He didn't pull any punches. He said, I cast forth all the household stuff to buy out of the chamber. We're not talking now. We're not negotiating here, and there's not going to be any compromise on this. We're not going to come to some mutually agreeable conclusion. I wonder, you know, it could be either way. I cast forth all the household stuff to buy. Now, it very well could mean that he had his people do it. You will have to wonder if maybe he didn't join in to physically throw his stuff out. He's so angry. Monty.
Kind of reminds me of once we read about in Ezra, where he came back and I think he found that they had intermingled in marriage again.
Yeah.
And it talks about, one place he talks about he pulled his beard, and another place he talks about he pulled their beards out. And so I think you see the same thing here with Nehemiah. Things were good when he left. He come back. The leadership's been corrupted. This priest has done put a place for this foreigner in the temple to stay. And then finds out that due to corrupt leadership, the people weren't being led properly, so they wasn't doing their tithes and offerings like they're supposed to. So basically, he just come in and had a meltdown and said, I'm going to fix this.
Yeah.
Threw all the guys' junk out in the street and told them to clean and purify the rooms. And he, you know, if y'all ain't going to take care of it, I will.
Yeah. You know, I have to think in our day and time that this kind of a reaction probably would have been criticized. You know, a strong, powerful reaction to that sort of error. You know, I think in our day and time, people would say, "Oh, Nehemiah's acting he's over the top here. He's being way too forceful. He needs to be more diplomatic. He needs to be kinder and gentler." I don't think so. Do you? Kinder and gentler were not words that you would use to describe Nehemiah's reaction to all this business, but Nehemiah's reaction was the right one. And we can learn from that. I think sometimes we need to be kinder and gentler. Sometimes we need to come at issues head on. It's a judgment, but we got to be ready to do that. Eric?
Did they think God resided in the temple, like in the tabernacle?
Well, yeah. I mean, so in the temple was the holy place, and behind the veil, the most holy place. And so in the most holy place represented the presence of God. Yeah. And so this would be a really troubling thing to a faithful person, to know that this foreigner was actually, they're corrupting it all. And he was rightfully upset. Did I see a hand? Oh, wait.
So do you think that the Ark of the Covenant is back there at that point?
You know, I hesitate to say that. I don't know. Because I don't know that the Ark of the Covenant is ever specifically mentioned after the return from captivity. So I don't know.
So, because that's where, in the most holy place, that God was seated in there.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it's the temple.
It's just not the same. It's not the same, for sure. Yeah. I don't know. Somebody may give me some research on that, but I don't believe that I can remember a mention of the Ark of the Covenant after the captivity. Monty?
I don't think the ark's actually mentioned after Solomon's time in the Old Testament.
I don't know. That's something to look up.
After it was placed in the temple when Solomon had the temple built, you don't really hear it mentioned anymore after that. And so when the temple was destroyed, obviously it wasn't there, and it's never really said that like other times, like the Philistines captured it once in the days of
David.
And so we hear about it and it being returned and what they went through in that process and all that. But then after Solomon built the temple, and it's specifically mentioned that they put it in there, and that I think only the tablets that Moses had made was the only thing still in it at the time. But then you don't hear about it anywhere else in the Bible, or when when the temple was destroyed, where it went, who took it, what happened, or anything. It's just not mentioned.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a mention of the cherubims.
Well, the top of the Ark of the Covenant was the cherubims facing each other, set it on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, and that was identified as the mercy seat, and that was specifically, the presence of God there on the mercy seat between the cherubims sitting on top of the Ark of the Covenant. But again, I don't. Again, somebody might correct me. I have to do some looking about that, but I don't think the Ark is ever mentioned. Certainly not after the captivity, but I don't know. All right. So they had not, as we said, had not been providing the necessary support for the priests and the Levites. They'd been forced to go out and try to fend for themselves. Notice there at the end of verse 10, the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled everyone to his field. They're having to make it on their own because they're not getting the support from the people that they should have gotten. Nehemiah, he goes probably right to the source of the problem. Verse 11, I contended with the rulers, and I said, why is this house of God forsaken? I gathered them together and set them in their place. And so, if you're going to be a ruler of the people, if you're going to be in charge, then you're also going to be held accountable when things are not going right, and these things are not going right, and Nehemiah calls them into accountability for it. There was more corruption. Look in still in chapter 13, in verse 15. In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in that day, wherein they sold victuals, and there dwelt men of Tyre also there, and which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do, and profane the Sabbath day? So, not to overuse the description, but things had gone completely bad. I mean, and it's pretty surprising that people who were doing very well when Nehemiah left had now gotten so far off base while he was in absence. There's probably a good object lesson there for us. It does not take long. You start compromising on one point or another. It's just, so if it's just one thing. So Yancey has this one harebrained idea, and we say, okay, we're going to let Yancey have his way on that. Well, if we let Yancey have his way on that, then Bob is going to come up with something, and we can't say no to Bob because we already said yes to Yancey. Once you crack that door open, there's no stopping. Sometimes I think brethren think that maybe we're too strict or too conservative or too concerned on doctrinal matters. But I'm going to tell you, the basis for that is seen very clearly here right in the days of Nehemiah. Everything had gone off course. One thing after another. Nehemiah comes back from his trip back to see the king, and everything is in terrible shape. It doesn't take long. And I mean it in a very short order. If we're not careful, we can be off in the ditch. And so, it demands constant, close attention. J.D.
Maybe you think of Moses coming down from the mountain.
40 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, in 40 days, as J.D. mentioned, Moses comes down from the mountain. They've made him an idol, and they're worshiping an idol of all things. Amazing. Wait.
Yeah, it's one. Which I'm just kind of going back to what you had said before. I don't remember what you said, but 1 Chronicles 9 actually gives a description of when they went back, it says, verse 1, all Israel who was listed in the genealogies recorded in the book of Kings of Israel, the people of Judah were taken captive to Babylon because of unfaithfulness. Now the first to resettle on their own property in their own towns were the Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants. And then it lists the different ones, but of the priests, it said in verse 13, who were heads of families, numbered 1,760. So I don't know if that was the initial or that was what you were talking about.
Those numbers, there's some, I read a little bit about those numbers not matching up exactly, but I'm not sure what the explanation is, but the numbers are a little different. And again, I'd have to look and see why, but I didn't research that. Tom?
Well, you go back and look at Israel, all along, in the time of Joshua, Joshua, after Moses, Joshua took over, Israel was fairly strong. But generation after Joshua was gone, they didn't remember anything.
Yeah, the elders who overlived Joshua stayed faithful, but the next generation.
Yeah. And then you look at the judges at the time, just up and down. They would go through and they'd turn away from God and start doing their own thing, and then then they'd ask for deliverance, and God would give them a judge, and they'd come back. But then the next thing you know, they
Just repeated cycles.
And then Solomon and things, the same thing. It's almost when in the absence of a strong leader, people change.
Yeah.
And we see that in almost everything that you go through. Politics. If we have a strong president and people respect him and follow him, things go pretty good. But if we have somebody that's sort of on the border, not really strong, lets the people influence his policies, things change really quick.
Doesn't take long. Does not take long. JD?
Just to further that point, if you think about our own country, is only 240 plus years old, and you think about how God was publicly discussed at the beginning and how it is now, big differences and not that long.
Well, even in our own lifetimes, even within the last 10 years, things are getting bad at an accelerated rate. I mean, things are going worse and worse exponentially. That's just what happens, and it doesn't take long. It sure doesn't. So Nehemiah is rightfully concerned about the violations of the Sabbath law. So in verse 19, he said, it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants said I at the gates that there should be no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kinds of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them and said to them, why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I'll lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. So he said, okay, we're going to lock the gates of Jerusalem, and you guys, there's not going to be any buying and selling. We're not going to have any Sabbath violation. But these foreigners who were selling their wares, they just camped right outside the walls, obviously tempting people to go outside the walls and again engage in commerce on the Sabbath day, which was forbidden. And he said, they did that a time or two, but I told them, you do that again, and I'll be on you, for doing so. I like the way it said there. What was the expression he used? Yeah, I'll lay hands on you. My page flipped. From that, I will lay hands on you if you do that again. And so he restores the proper observance of the Sabbath, which had also been corrupted. Verse 22, I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. In those days also I saw Jews that had married wives of Ashdod and of Ammon and of Moab, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them and cursed them and smote certain of them and plucked off their hair, made them swear by God, saying, ye shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons, or for yourselves. Now remember, Ezra Ezra was not that much prior to Nehemiah. There was a pretty good gap of time between Zerubbabel and Ezra, but there was less than 15 years gap between Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra had just dealt with this. There had been a big issue with marrying foreign wives, and Ezra demanded that they separate themselves from these unlawful wives. And remember, it said, I think the very last verse of the book of Ezra, some of these women had children by the Jewish men, but they were still instructed to separate themselves from those unlawful marriages. And they had fallen right back into that practice. This may be where you were thinking about, Monty, where he says, I plucked off their hair when I found out what they were doing, and commanded that they shouldn't. And then he uses an example that I think is so pertinent. Verse 26, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God. God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. You know, I personally have used that example talking to maybe a young person who's thinking about marrying someone who's not a Christian and the dangers of doing so, that even wise Solomon wasn't able to handle that temptation. I remember talking to one young man one time, and he was prepared to marry this girl who was not a Christian, but he thought it would be okay. He thought that would work out okay, and I just very simply asked him. Cindy could probably remember the incident. I just simply asked him, "You think you're wiser than Solomon?" And it just took him aback. He didn't have an answer. Solomon couldn't handle it. Why should we think we would be able to handle that? It's just a dangerous, extremely spiritually dangerous thing. And Solomon or Nehemiah here uses that as an example. Verse 29, remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood. By the way, that verse 28. One of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. I love Nehemiah. I mean, he is so emphatic in his reactions when he finds things that are wrong. Here's the son-in-law of the high priest the son of the high priest who is son-in-law to Tobiah, or Sanballat, one of the great enemies of the Jews. And the high priest's son has married Sanballat's daughter. I chased him from me. I'm not putting up with that. Get out of my sight. Wait.
Sounds kind of like Eli.
Yeah.
Because Eli was a high priest, and what his sons were doing looks like the same thing. So, you don't appreciate the high priest at this point because he's tolerated.
Yeah, exactly right. All right. So, verse 30, thus cleansed I them from all strangers and appointed the wards of the priests and the Levites, everyone in his business. And for the wood offering at times appointed for the first fruits, remember me, O my God, for good. And I think we do. We remember Nehemiah as an effective, powerful, faithful leader for God. And I think, and we have done this before, and I know special series of lessons have been constructed around the leadership qualities of Nehemiah, which were excellent. Again, I think in our day and time, Nehemiah would probably be considered to be too harsh. He's too direct. He lacks loving kindness. I think our modern day people would probably criticize him at that level. The Bible, I think, holds him up as a wonderful example as what a leader ought to be. Any final thoughts or comments? Bonnie?
I like it that a place or two here he's talking about the things they've been doing. And he says, look, God's going to wipe the city out for this once. We've done been carried off into captivity once. The city's been destroyed. And now you're turning around doing the same things again. You're basically saying, how can we expect it to be any different? How's things going to be better? God will do it to us again if you're not careful. And so he's looking back at history. He's looking at God's law. He's saying, this is what God said to do. And as long as I've got something to do with it, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, I think so. Katie?
I think it's interesting to note because, on his bravery, because we saw that he worked for the king or was some kind of servant, when he left and came to Jerusalem. And it doesn't really say how long he was helping them.
Yeah.
But the fact that he went back and then asked to leave again
Yeah.
just shows how brave he was, because he could have sent anyone else to go
I have done enough here. I'm coming back. I got a cushy job here with the king, and I'm just going to take it easy now. And he wanted to go back. And it's a good thing he did, because he found a lot of trouble when he went back. Good point. All right. Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, I think we've had a good study. There's just such great history and important moral lessons to be learned in Ezra and Nehemiah. As we mentioned earlier, next week, Lord willing, we're going to start into a study of baptism. And there's a study guide on the back if you want to look ahead at that. It'd probably be very helpful if you did. But that will be our study next week, Lord willing.